this traumatic childhood memory that I cannot forget. Sometimes I dream about it or just think about it late at night when I can't sleep and I'm feeling stressed. It sucks, and I thought maybe posting about it might help me get over it a little. So I'm sending this to you today, and when I was a kid, we were always struggling for money. I feel like we moved houses maybe 6 or 7 times, usually a downgrade to a much cheaper property, even a trailer one time, followed by a big upgrade because my dad never lived within our means. As soon as he had a bit of dough, we started spending it, living in luxury. It was kind of sweet. He wanted to provide for me, my mom, and my baby brother, but he just wasn't good at keeping hold of money. When he had a good job, we'd get takeout food every day, and he'd shower us with toys and mom with gifts. Then we'd lose everything and end up in some dirty-ass trailer park or something, and everyone would be stressed. Dad would never take it out on us, but he'd take it out on himself, smoking and drinking and falling into a stupor, so it took longer to break out of the rut and find the next job. I never really knew what my father did for work. He didn't have a profession exactly. He took on random jobs and schemes pretty much. He was always looking for his latest get-rich-quick gimmick, and if I'd try to list or even remember most of them, I'd probably be here all night. One time, he sold cigarettes out of the back of his car until the law shut him down. Another time, he got a group of parolee friends working as home decorators until a client realized that he didn't have the necessary licenses and insurance when one of the guys fell through the roof. It was just things like this, all the time, and while he was a fun dad, it also made my childhood incredibly stressful, especially after my baby brother Barton was born and wouldn't stop crying all the time. The specific memory that sticks in my mind happened when we were renting a fairly nice house in the suburbs. I guess Dad's latest scheme had been paying off because things had been going well for a while and I was beginning to let myself relax. I remember the sun was setting, so that it must have been mid-evening when the knock on the door came. I knew my mom and dad were downstairs with Barton, so I was surprised when the knock sounded again and nobody answered. I looked out the window of my bedroom at the front of the house. A guy was standing at the door. He looked up at me and something about him terrified me. I know it's silly, but in my head I kind of equate him to that Rocksteady character from the Ninja Turtles. You know that big rhinoceros with a tank top, khaki pants, and big boots? This guy reminded me of him, only, human. He had this mullet that looked ex-army and an earring that kind of glinted in one ear and tattoos all up his thick, muscled arms. He must have caught sight of me looking at him because he looked up and kind of scowled at me from under a very thick, ugly unibrow. I know I'm probably imagining him as more troll-like and terrifying in my mind than he actually was, but I guess that's how childhood traumas kind of get at you, I guess. And now I'm going to call him Rocksteady, but he began hammering on the front door with a very meaty fist. He shouted that he knew we were home. He'd seen someone in the upstairs window. An instant terror and guilt flooded through me. Immediately, I heard footsteps downstairs, Dad going to the front door and Mom coming upstairs. My bedroom door opened just as I heard the front door unlatch. Mom was holding Barton, reassuring me that everything was okay and to come back into the room and play. I ignored her and ran to the window. Dad had stepped outside into the front yard with Rocksteady, and Rocksteady was sizing up Dad, looming over him very menacingly. And my dad wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a buff guy who worked out. He was fairly short, and in my mind, he was fragile. He was always smiling and joking and being silly, and the idea of someone like Rocksteady hurting him seemed like a genuine possibility. Even more so as I watched this guy grab Dad by his shirt and drag him into the street. I started to cry and bang on the window, but Mom came and pulled me away and made me play with Barton for a bit, even though inside I was absolutely breaking. After 5 minutes or so, Mom had to use the bathroom, so I darted to the window again. Dad and Rocksteady were in the street. Dad was pacing back and forth, gesturing and talking animatedly in his way, and Rockstar seemed calmer and was leaning up against a muscle car. I watched as Dad and Rockstar shook hands, and then Dad came back into the house. He was all smiles and cheery after that, Nothing to worry about, he said. Just a simple misunderstanding. Rocksteady was a guy he worked with and his paycheck hadn't gone through, but it was all sorted out now and everything had been squared away. I told my dad that man reminded me of the Rhino from Ninja Turtles, and he seemed to find that hilarious. I thought Mom was calm and fine too, but in retrospect, she clearly wasn't. I went to bed more relaxed that night. It was around 1 in the morning when I heard the crash. It was coming from downstairs, the sound of wood splintering and the front door being kicked in. I looked out the window in terror to see 3 men coming through our front door, and Rocksteady was taking up the rear. There was commotion from elsewhere upstairs, Mom and Dad reacting to the break-in, I now know, and then smashing and breaking glass from downstairs, and next, screaming and yelling. I could now hear 4 male voices, including my father's, and then my mom screaming. Finally, Barton started crying, adding to the cacophony, and Mom's footsteps came thundering upstairs. I'd already locked my door and she rattled on it. I asked who it was and she said it was Mom. She said it was good that I'd locked my door and to keep it locked and stay there, and she was going to take Barton into their room. She told me not to come out under any circumstances and that Daddy was fine and not to worry. His friends had just come over and they were just being loud. Even at my young age, I knew that this was all nonsense, but I told Mom I'd stay put. So I had to sit there on my bed listening to the 3 men smash up our things downstairs. Dad was yelling for a while and then I heard another crash and his voice stopped. I was crying to myself, these heavy sobs, and I felt like my chest was going to burst and my heart would explode. It felt like the chaos went on forever. Eventually, things fell silent and I thought I was safe. And suddenly there was a hammering on my door. The wooden frame shuddered and I screamed. A male voice I didn't recognize called out, telling me to open the door. I'll just call this one Creepshow. And he called me a little B-word and said that if I was Colin's daughter, Colin was my dad, I was gonna suffer. Creepshow started saying all these awful things he was going to do to me that I don't want to repeat here. Stuff that as a little kid I'd never even heard of before. I was still sobbing, crying, and freaking out. Then I heard a bang from out in the hallway, like someone punching a wall. A voice asked what the F Creepshow was talking about, and I recognized the voice as that Rocksteady guy. Creepshow said that Colin's daughter, the little B-word, was hiding in here and he was going to drag her out and show Colin what happened to the daughters of men who don't pay up. Rocksteady absolutely lost it. He started screaming at this guy, saying that I was only 7 years old and what kind of sicko threatens a kid. That they were just here to scare Colin to get what they were owed, but this was way over the line. Creepshow didn't back down and started hurling abuse at Rocksteady. There was a moment of silence, and then suddenly my door came splintering open. A man I didn't even recognize, who I later learned was Creepshow, flew backwards into the room, having just been drop-kicked probably through the door by that Rocksteady guy. And now Rocksteady rushed into the room, grabbed Creepshow from the floor, dragged him up and threw him out. He looked at me, and the terrifying guy I'd been so afraid of suddenly melted away, and his face softened. I've never seen someone transform like that before or since. Rocksteady told me he was sorry. He didn't really mean for things to go this way. And then he returned to beating the absolute crap out of Creepshow for daring to threaten a little girl like that. The outcome of this story is truly bizarre. Rocksteady genuinely felt so bad about bringing that kind of person to our house that he even offered to pay Dad for the damage. Dad was a bit bruised and scared, but ultimately okay. He didn't really want to call the cops because, well, whatever he was involved in probably wasn't very legal. Rocksteady and the other guy, who was just some sidekick that I never even saw, promised that they'd take Creepshow away and deal with him. Dad told us later that the 3 men were some bikers he'd hired to work on a project with him, and something had gone wrong with paying them apparently. He made things right with Rocksteady, and after that, Dad went completely straight. I guess it took my life being threatened to finally wake him up. Dad passed away recently, and he lived an honest life ever since that day. I have no idea what happened to Rocksteady or that Creepshow guy, and it's not Rocksteady who causes me to wake up at night, panicking and scared. It's Creepshow. The things he said to me through that door, the punishments he promised to beat out of me, they're not anything that a 7-year-old girl should ever have to hear. No, I'm sure Creepshow isn't even alive anymore. When Rocksteady drop-kicked him through my bedroom door, he looked like he must have been in his 50s even then. He'd had to have been over 80 by now, so I can only hope that he died in pain and misery. But sometimes late at night, I imagine he's still out there, walking up the stairs to my bedroom door. And this time my dad and Rocksteady are no longer around to stop him. When I was a teenager, I used to share this as a ghost story, but then something happened in my adult years that made it very real and somehow a lot scarier than when I thought I'd encountered a spirit. So bear with me. To my child mind, this was a paranormal encounter, but it's not, and you'll find out why in the second half. I know you don't often run supernatural stories lately on the channel, so I wanted to assure you up front that this isn't that, even if it seems so at first. When I was a kid, my family lost our house and we had to downgrade. That's what I was told anyway, but honestly, I loved the new house. It was older than our previous zero-lot line house, a row house with 3 floors, a tiny backyard, and an alleyway that ran in between the middle of the houses and then along the back of the properties. To this day, I insist that this new house was better than our much more valuable house from before. The garden was overgrown, filled with mystery and wonder for a kid like me. There was a broken-down greenhouse that contained all sorts of treasures, and the people next door owned a tortoise that would sometimes break into our yard. There was a crumbling shed filled with the remnants of the last owners, and next to that, adjacent to the back alley, was a big pile of trash made up of things from our move, like mattresses and boxes, but also discarded garden equipment, sort of a bunch of statues and ornaments, all sorts of crazy fun things for an 8-year-old boy like me to mess with. The trash pile in the garden was fenced off from within the garden, and the gate had rusted shut. I could climb over it, but I'd been banned from doing so by my mom and was worried about me falling over the fence and impaling myself on a rake or a garden gnome or something. If I wanted to explore the trash paradise, I had to exit through the front door, walk a few houses down, and then head down the alleyway and around the back of the houses where the trash pile had a much more accessible gate. And this is what I was doing on the day this happened. I walked down the long, dark, and honestly a bit scary arched tunnel leading to the open-air back alley. There was all sorts of old graffiti on the bricks, and not spray paint or tags, but scratches using stones from the ground. The neighborhood's pass kids had left their mark, and I've always paused to read some of it before continuing on. Janice plus John forever. Betsy and Evelyn lived here 1963. Things like that. I still live in my childhood home to this day, so I see these scribblings regularly. I've added a few of my own over the years with some friends. I just read a new one that said something like, Arthur ate his kids, and it put the spooks in me, understandably. So I guess I was a little jumpy when I emerged from the darkness and into the alley. I looked up and down just to see if any of the neighborhood kids were back here, and the alley was completely unoccupied from both ends. I walked past the 3 back gardens that led to my own. When I reached mine, I tried to unlatch the gate, but the metal hook had gotten rusted or stuck somehow since the last time I used it. I was reaching over the fence trying to work out why it wouldn't come unhooked when I felt rough, pinching fingers on my arm. I spun around and came face to face with an ancient-looking man. He wasn't one of those kindly, pleasant-looking old folks. This guy had a mean, spiteful look in his eyes. He had dirty whiskers sprouting from his chin and wiry white hair that had yellowed with tobacco discoloration at the temples. In my memory, his irises were non-existent, just huge black pupils swimming in his scleras. Tufts of hair grew from his nostrils, and his big ears protruded in a way that almost made me laugh. It was hard to laugh with his tight, vicious grip on my arm, though. The man absolutely stank, too, of dampness and just body odor. I tried to pull away, but his fingernails dug into my arm. He asked me what the hell I was doing, snooping back here. I told him I lived here, and he spat out that he thought I was a liar. And when he talked, I saw his teeth weren't just yellow, they were brown, black, or even missing. His breath stank of death, and that's the best I can describe it. My mind immediately went back to the graffiti that I'd just seen. Arthur ate his kids. And this guy certainly smelled like he'd eaten a kid or two in his day. The old man tugged on my arm again hard and made me wince in pain. He called me a liar and a thief and said he'd turn me into the authorities. He told me that I had to come with him so I wouldn't run away. I'd been warned by my parents and teachers about what dirty, stinky old men could do to young boys, even ones as old as 8 and as brave as me, so there was absolutely no way that I was letting him take me anywhere. Besides, even if he was telling the truth and he was going to hand me over to the quote-unquote authorities, I hadn't done anything wrong. The alleyway was public, and the house I was going into was mine. I did the only thing I could think to do, pulled myself free from his arm, and then yeeted myself over the little fence leading into the backyard. Mom was right. There was a danger of impaling myself if I jumped into the trash pile recklessly, and I was damn lucky that I managed to stop with a sharp shard of metal just slightly pressing into my thigh, enough to draw blood and make me wince, but not enough to do any damage. Quickly avoiding further damage from the spike, I turned around to tell the old man triumphantly that I was in my house now and I lived here, and if he liked he could knock on the front door and ask my parents, and they could confirm that I was very much allowed to be here. The leaping to turning process must have taken all of 3 seconds, but when I turned about to face this old man, he was now gone. I was almost disappointed. I was robbed of my righteous indignation and the chance to show an adult that I was right and he was wrong. So I peered over the fence to see where he'd gone. The alleyway was empty. I looked left and right, no sign of the guy. I hadn't heard any of the other back gates open. All the other houses had high fences leading to the alley. It was only my house that had a small temporary fence because they'd taken the main fence down to help us move in, and we hadn't replaced it yet until this trash paradise had been removed. I unlatched the gate, noticing that a stick had been caught in the loop, preventing me from unhooking it. Then I ran to the head of the alley and looked down the tunnel. There was no way that the old man could have simply reached the street already, and yet sure enough, he was gone. I went back into my back garden, thoroughly done with playing outside, and from then on, I had a ghost story to tell. For years I recounted the story of how a ghostly old man had appeared from nowhere, grabbed me, threatened me, and then disappeared into the ether. Of course, most people didn't believe it. They assumed I'd either imagined him and he'd never actually grabbed me, or he had grabbed me and he must have been one of my neighbors. He wasn't one of my neighbors, though. Like I said, I still live in that house now, and I met every neighbor from back then. Nobody remotely matched his description, and I never saw him again, and I know that he didn't disappear into one of the back gardens. I never really considered one of the two options that must have happened, though. Either the man snuck through the fence leading to the other side of the alley, which led to a retirement home, or he sprinted away when I broke free of his grasp, fast enough to have disappeared when I went looking. I'm going to guess it was the former, though, because many years later, I found out that the old man had come from the retirement home. It's more believable that he snuck through some type of unseen hole in the fence than this old-ass man sprinted away faster than a college athlete. So why was this dirty old man lurking in the alleyway behind my house, grabbing an unsuspecting kid? I met up with a friend a couple of years ago who works in law enforcement. He asked me if I was still living at my address, and I said yeah. He'd said he'd thought about me recently because a case he was working on had involved someone who lived at the retirement home in the 90s. Apparently the guy had been a violent offender in his heyday and had spent quite a bit of time in prison. Then eventually he'd been released and ended up at that very retirement home. My buddy wouldn't tell me exactly what this guy had done, but he was horrified and almost actively angry at the fact that I'd never been informed that such a violent offender lived behind my property. After I met with my buddy, I asked my parents if they'd ever known about it, and they hadn't, so I guess we just didn't have to be informed back then. Now back to the present with my buddy though, he told me that the guy was long dead now and that he'd cropped up as a potential accomplice of a current suspect they had who was part of a ring. So my buddy was curious if I'd ever seen anyone being weird with kids around my area. He described the man, and while I can't be sure because ultimately he was generic skeevy old white dude, it very much sounded like the ghost who grabbed me in the alley. And I reminded my friend about my true ghost story from my childhood, which I told him and others a bunch of times, and we both went a bit pale and quiet. Honestly, I think I preferred it when I thought the old fogey was just some ghost. I can look back on a ghostly encounter with wonder and excitement. But a near miss with an old pederast, though, well, that's a lot more traumatic. So me and my family moved to a new town in the early 2000s. Dad got a promotion at work, so we upgraded and moved to a nice place in the suburbs. Me and my sister got to attend a better school, Mom got to meet some new friends, and Dad had a much shorter drive to work. Everything was great. I was really excited to move, and I'd never moved to a different house before, and it seemed like a wild adventure. These days I look back and think what an idiot I was. Moving houses isn't something that I wish on my worst enemy, even under positive circumstances. It's so freaking stressful. But back then, I was a 6-year-old kid, so the world was all sunshine and rainbows. I'd never known true fear or suffering. At least until the day this all happened. I remember that day that I had an argument with my sister. We were twins, so even as brother and sister, we almost never argue. She's my best friend and I hung out with her nearly all the time, so I was really salty and upset that this day we'd fallen out. I don't even remember why, but I definitely remember that it was her fault. Hi Holly, if you're listening to this, you know I'ma send it to you, if Let's Read narrates it. We'd lived in the neighborhood for about 6 months by this point, but I'd only met and befriended the kids that lived across the street, brothers Mike and Joe. Most of the other houses were occupied by older folks. It was kind of a quiet community, perfect for older couples but less popular for families with kids. I knew there was one other family though, just at the end of the cul-de-sac around the corner. They were a big family, mom, dad, 3 sisters, and a brother. We knew them vaguely from church, and they were known as an extremely nice, friendly family, so I thought nothing of just wandering around their house and knocking for them to see if they wanted to come play. 2 of them did, the girl my age, Kathy, and her brother, Will. We played various ball games and whatever other silly things kids enjoyed back then. It was fun, and I liked them. Then, from a field across the road, a group of other kids came strolling over. One of them was Will's friend and a few other kids, and then Will's friend's cousin, who was a chunky, loud, and angry girl called Hester. Hester was about 10, so older than most of us, and she lorded that fact over the other kids. Immediately I could tell that she was an insufferable little brat, and after just an hour she started picking on 5 or 6 different kids in turn, making people cry or turn on each other in the way that bullies do. Of course, because Hester was such an obnoxious, unpleasant person, everyone wanted to impress her. And that's how it is when you're kids, I guess. After a bit, Hester declared that our neighborhood was fake and gay and dumb, and if us stupid kids knew what was good for us, we'd follow her across the field to a much cooler place. None of us were allowed to go that far from home, and none of us wanted to get hurt by Hester either, as she would be threatening. And the place that Hester led us to was actually cool. It was the beginnings of a park, sort of half set up and half under construction. A set of monkey bars and a swing set had already been set up, and a teeter-totter and a merry-go-round were abandoned on the green half covered in plastic. I guess it says something about the nature of the area that these things were just left there waiting for construction to resume after the weekend, and that the area wasn't fenced off or anything. And like moths to the flame, some of the kids waddled wide-eyed over to the swings and began playing there. And Hester commanded everyone to follow her, though, and led us to a stack of concrete tubes. They were stacked in a pyramid shape, 3 on the bottom, 2 in the middle, 1 on the top. "Who's brave enough to go inside?" Hester screeched, pointing at the middle tube on the bottom. And this seemed like a terribly stupid idea. The tubes were fastened together with some kind of metallic straps that held them in place, but even then, and even at 6, I was aware that these tubes were potentially incredibly dangerous, and incredibly stupid that anyone had left them unattended. "I'll do it," I said. So I got down on my hands and knees and carefully, nervously crawled into the tube. And I called that I was in, and then behind me, the light disappeared. I tried to turn around and discovered that the tube was just too small for me to turn around in. And that's how I discovered that I suffer from crippling claustrophobia. I began to panic almost immediately, backing down the tube. My foot pressed against something. Hester and the other kids had put some kind of board or block over the exit. I tried to force against it, but the concrete scraped my bare knees and I couldn't get any trajectory to kick back against whatever they were holding there. And frantically, I already started to cry. I began to sort of crawl down the pipe towards the other end. It was very slow going. The pipe was about 20 feet long, made of rough, spiky concrete and little stones that dug painfully into my knees. I was about halfway to the end when Hester's face appeared in front of me at the end of the tube. She yelled at me that I was stuck in there and called me a little crybaby. This, of course, made me cry, which made the other kids start laughing at me, taunting me to impress Hester. Her ugly face looked in again, and then everything went dark as they covered that end of the tube with a board, too. I began to absolutely freak out, screaming and crying. I looked over my shoulder and saw from behind me. I realized they only had 1 board to cover the exit and were running back and forth outside. I began moving backwards, pleading with them to let me out. I heard Hester yell, and just as I'd neared the other end, light poured in far ahead of me and they covered the exit in freedom yet again. Like I said, I'd never experienced my true fear or suffering until that point, but suddenly it was like a little imp was sitting on my shoulders, punching me rapidly and repeatedly in the temples. I began absolutely hollering, crying, screaming, and begging them to let me out. Hester laughed and yelled at me to go to the other end, that the board was stuck, but I could get out if I crawled. So I crawled, blinking towards the light through my tears, and sure enough, when I was near the end, the kids jeered and howled at me, and then covered the end instead. And this process went on a couple of more times, each time with Hester promising me that they'd let me out this time, and each time they'd cover the exit. And by now I was cut up and bloody and screaming and obviously crying, and to this day I don't know what kind of psychopathic little brat Hester must have been to keep this up. In defense of the other kids, by now a few of them were arguing with her, shouting at her even, and I didn't know it, but Kathy and Will had already left to go get an adult at this point. As far as I knew from within my concrete tomb, though, all of those kids were out there enjoying it, and they wanted me dead. I don't know if I had some kind of actual seizure or if it was just a panic attack, but I began flailing and kicking. My skin burned with agony as I punched and kicked the concrete interior of the tube. I don't know what I was trying to do, if I thought that I could break my way out or something, but regardless, something did break. I heard a cracking, a crumbling noise, heard a metallic snap, and then felt a seismic shifting as the tubes on top of me began to roll. All hell broke loose. Hester and the other kids began screaming in fear. I started to roll, dust from the concrete tube stinging my eyes and making it almost impossible to see. I was pretty much in the middle of the damn tube. Blissful, blessed light flooded in from ahead of me, and I began to scramble as quick as I could towards freedom. I knew that I was in genuine, serious danger of actually dying if I didn't. As I reached the end, I felt hands on me dragging me roughly out of the tube, and I was pulled out onto the grass. Then I heard this rumble and a crunch, and heard the most haunting, ear-splitting scream, the worst sound I'd ever heard in my life. Kathy and Will's dad, Jack, was the one who pulled me to safety. They'd gone and told him what Hester was doing, and he'd come out to check and then rushed over in horror when he saw what the kids were doing to me. Meanwhile, Holly had come to apologize and witnessed me being pulled from the concrete tube seconds before it cracked and caved in on itself. If Jack hadn't pulled me out those last few feet, I genuinely don't think that I'd be here to write this story, at least not in one piece. The horrific scream that I heard had come from Hester's cousin, George, Will's friend who lived nearby. One of the concrete tubes had just rolled off the stack and literally crushed his leg. I caught a glimpse of it as I was carried away by Jack, and holy crap, it was like there wasn't even a leg there. He was eventually fine, thankfully, but he had to have multiple metal pins surgically inserted into his leg, and a bunch of physical therapy, and Hester's family had to foot the entire bill. I have no idea what happened to her, and I wish her all the best, and I hope she went on to have a great and fulfilling life. Just kidding. I don't think I can really say what I feel about her without getting you demonetized. And so that's the childhood trauma that still keeps me up at night to this day. I still can't stay in enclosed spaces. Even elevators make me panic, and while I can manage them if I have to, I'd always rather take the stairs. I have an absolutely weird story for you, and it drives me nuts that I've never been able to work out the exact truth behind it. So maybe you and your listeners can give me some theories. At the very least, maybe it'll help me stop having nightmares about it if I finally talk about it to strangers on the internet. It was a pretty bad week to start with. Mom had asked her friend if I could stay with them in the weekdays before she had to do a work thing. Mom's friend had 2 kids, Benny and Daniel. Benny was my age and was my friend from school, and Daniel was younger. She was kind of a whiny, wet blanket kid who was constantly crying and moaning and kicking up a fuss about stuff. And that's why Benny and I didn't really take it seriously that day when Daniel fell and wouldn't get up. Instead, he just sat there, screaming and crying, saying, "It hurts, it hurts." We laughed at him to start with. It had only been a little fall, tripping backwards onto his butt. But when he carried on crying, we realized that maybe he was serious this time. Long story short, he had fallen backwards against the furnace of this fireplace thing and cracked his tailbone. Easy enough to recover from, but it required a hospital trip, and there was no way that Benny and Daniel's mom, Nancy, was going to tolerate Benny and I under her feet in a hospital waiting room all day. So Nancy called her friend, Kate, and asked if she could look after Benny and his friend they were babysitting, aka me. Kate was the mother of Elena and Carl. Elena was our friend from school, so we knew her. And sorry if this is some tangle web of confusion, but this is important. Me, Benny, and Elena were 7. Carl was 5, and Kate was their mom who was looking after us for the day while Benny, who was 4, was getting checked out in the hospital. Another important part, Kate and her husband Arnold were absolutely rich. They lived in a house that, to me as a kid, was completely huge and daunting. It was built in the 19th century, if not before, and in my memory it was like 8 stories. I'm sure it can't have been that big in retrospect, but it was this very old country house that had been in their family for probably generations at this point. Creepy portraits of various old members of their family hung on the oak-paneled walls. They had a housekeeper, a gardener, and a maid. And there were at least 2 grandfather clocks in the house, and I swear to God there was a genuine suit of armor in one of the corridors. The whole house was absolutely mysterious and wonderful and fascinating, and it smelled of old things. There were numerous cabinets and cupboards to explore, and various closed doors that were tantalizing and appealing, and there was even a music room filled with instruments, including a piano that I was absolutely ready to try out, as I was this up-and-coming pianist who'd passed 3 grades already. Naturally, because it was such a cool house with so much promise and excitement, we were allowed to stay in the freaking hallway, where we were given a box of toys and told to sit on the floor and play all morning. Elena and Carl were both really pale and quiet and pretty weird, and they seemed a little scared of their mom. Hell, me and Benny were scared of their mom. She was strict in a I want to seem cool and hip, but I also hate kids way, and clearly resented having to raise her own children, let alone look after Benny and I for the day. And I am pretty sure that she wasn't actually Elena's biological mom, but I never had any contact with the family after this one day. Things just didn't fully add up in my young boy mind, and all this just contributes to the mystery in my head. Elena called her Kate and Carl called her Mom, and at the time, I could not for the life of me work out how or why this was possible. I guess I didn't grasp the idea of a stepmom not being called Mom back when I was 7. After a few hours of mind-numbing boredom in which we were forced to play with toys that were for babies, we had lunch. I forget what it was, but I remember it being the most boring, bland lunch I've ever eaten, and I remember thinking that I was glad that we didn't have a big, valuable house if it meant that you had to eat boring crap as a sort of compromise. Benny was normally the class clown, but I guess he'd been babysat by Kate before because he was on his best boring behavior that day. He'd barely talk, in fact, and it was really unsettling to see my friend acting so muted. He was normally the leader, and he would get us into all sorts of trouble. After lunch, Kate allowed us to play in the garden, which was a sprawling, mysterious wonderland of trees. There was a pond, flower beds, and a vegetable garden. So of course, we were only allowed to stay on the patio area, in sight of Kate at all times while she sat in the kitchen watching daytime TV. After half an hour, it began to rain, and Elena and Carl would apparently catch pneumonia if they stayed in the rain, so off we all went back to the cold tiled hallway where we had to play with baby toys again. After a while, Kate announced that she was going to take a nap, and I watched her disappear up 2 flights of stairs. Not that she'd been watching us before, she'd been in the other room with the door half open, but now that Kate had fully left, I was hoping it meant that we could actually do something a bit more exciting. I suggested this to the others, but Elena seemed horrified and said that we had to do what Kate said and we'd better stay in the hallway playing with Carl's jigsaw puzzles because it wouldn't be good to get into trouble. Benny had gone to the bathroom and hadn't come back for 10 minutes. I looked around at the home with this very sad longing. Surely there had to be something cool we could do. I asked Elena if the house was haunted, and Carl began to sniffle, and Elena explained that he was afraid of ghosts. God, what a crybaby. He made Danny look like a badass, and Elena explained that no, there were no ghosts here. I asked who else lived there, and she said it was just her, Kate, and their dad, who was always away during the week in the city. Even at 7 years old, I knew enough to feel bad for Elena here. Kate clearly wasn't a nice mom, and I kinda understood why Elena was always on her own and lonely at school. I asked about the house staff, and Elena said that they came from the nearby village a few days a week. And I found it incredible that such a huge house could have so few people living in it, especially when the kids seemingly weren't allowed in most of the rooms. Benny still wasn't back, and I needed to use the bathroom. At first, Elena said that I'd have to wait, but then she relented and said that there was one upstairs as long as I promised not to touch or break anything. I needed to pee so bad I thought that I was actually going to wet myself, so I promised her on my life. She told me it was upstairs and on the left, so I ran upstairs, quiet as I could so Kate wouldn't hear and yell at me. I found the bathroom, and it looked and smelled like my great-nan's bathroom, full of pink doilies and one of those knitted toilet roll covers with a doll's body in it. None of it looked like it belonged to a young modern family, and the whole place was so weird. I washed my hands and left the bathroom. I was about to go downstairs and behave myself, honestly, but then I heard sounds coming from one of the rooms. I knew Kate had gone up to the next floor and their dad was away for work, so I thought maybe Benny had come upstairs even though there was no way that he could have gotten up here without seeing me. I approached the door. I heard another sound from inside, and it sounded like a person in distress. To this day, I would swear that I heard the word help. I opened the door, and the sight that lay inside stays with me into adulthood. It was my first real experience of seeing a genuinely sick person. A 4-poster bed sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by translucent medical-style curtains. Monitors and machines beeped from beside the bed. I didn't recognize them at the time, but since I know there was at least a heart monitor and some kind of machine to aid with breathing. There were a couple of other machines there too that I can't even begin to tell you the function of. The room stank of illness and antiseptic. It had the function of a hospital room, but otherwise it was like the rest of the house. Oak-paneled walls, old furniture, fancy cabinets, and yes, another grandfather clock. It was just the bed, the machines, and the person in the bed that were out of place. I took a step in the room, trying to see more details of the figure that lay in the bed. I genuinely can't be sure if I'm misremembering this, but in my head, I remember her being fully covered in a sheet, almost like a shroud. I genuinely thought that I was looking at a dead body at first. Then I realized the machines at least suggested that the person was alive, and looking closer, I could see the sheet rising and falling as the person breathed. I had a vague understanding of what a coma was, and it occurred to me that this mysterious person hidden away in the bedroom of this huge house might be in one. At least I considered this for a moment when the figure sat bolt upright and yanked the curtain covering the bed away. The person in the bed was a woman. She can't have been older than Kate or Nancy or my own mom, but she looked severely aged at the same time. Her hair was slicked back with sweat, her skin pale and gaunt. She looked a bit like Elena, but ancient. The woman held out a hand to me, and I thought that she was calling to me. She started making sounds with her mouth, this sort of clicking coming from her throat, then moaning, but nothing I could recognize as words. And then her eyes snapped open wide, and so did her mouth, and it was like she was screaming, but silently. Again, I can't be sure if this was just in my head, as the stories become more terrifying to me over the years, but I'm sure she pointed at me. I let out a little scream, turned, ran, and thundered down the stairs. When I asked Elena who the woman in the room was, she looked completely pale and sick. She told me it was her mom, and I told her that no, it wasn't. It was a sick woman, not Kate. Dumbass me couldn't grasp that Mom was someone else. Benny had returned from the bathroom by this point, and I started frantically telling him about the sick woman upstairs. His eyes widened, and he said that we should go and check on her. Elena started whispering in panic to us, saying that we mustn't go back upstairs. Carl, of course, started crying again. And before we could do anything, Kate came storming down. And I had never been yelled at by my friend's mom before in a way that Kate screamed at me then, calling me a disobedient little brat, a troublemaker, all sorts of things. I burst into tears. I had no idea what I'd done wrong. I thought someone was in trouble in the room, so I checked on them, and then when I realized I'd disturbed some sick lady, I'd left. Kate was having none of it though, and said that there was no way that she was putting up with this. She used a lot more swear words than that, and I remember being shocked at an adult talking to me that way. She called up Nancy, who luckily had just gotten out of the hospital with Danny. Kate stared at us silently for 20 minutes it took for Nancy to come collect us. Nancy scolded us repeatedly on the drive home, then made us sit in the utility room for the last hour of the day until Mom came to pick me up. I heard Mom and Nancy talking in quiet voices. Then on the way home, I told Mom exactly what had happened. I guess Mom took my side because that night I heard her on the phone yelling at Nancy that it wasn't appropriate to send me to be looked after by Kate anyway, and that nobody had the right to yell at her kid and punish him for something that he hadn't even done wrong. They stopped being friends after that, and Benny and I kind of stopped hanging out shortly after, which was fine by me because he was always getting me in trouble anyways. I didn't really expect the incident to have such a long-lasting effect in my mind as it has. I have absolutely no idea what was going on in that house. When I saw Elena at school the next week, she was quiet and wouldn't talk to me and had bruises on her arms. I wish I'd been able to do something about it back then. I'm pretty sure some kind of abuse was going on in that household, but as a 7-year-old, I didn't have the vocabulary or know-how to say or do anything about it. I never did find out who that woman was, although I can hazard an educated guess that it was Elena's mom. My own mom has always been under the impression that Elena's mom was dead, so I have no idea why she was sealed away in a room in that house, hooked up to machines. I wish I could solve this mystery, and like I said, maybe your listeners have some theories, but in the meantime, I guess I'll continue waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by nightmares of a dying woman, sitting upright in her sick bed, throwing back her shroud and pointing straight at me. This is a story that happened to me in the UK when I was a kid. Me and my buddy Jim used to hang out at this local park near his house quite a lot, where we'd chill on the swings, smoke on the bench, play a bit of football, you know, the kind of crap teenagers get up to at the park. We were honestly good friends, goody two-shoes even, and just never got up to anything sordid, really. I had a couple of friends who made a hobby of setting fires inside public toilets, like inside the actual toilet bowls, and they'd recently been yanked into the cop shop for a warning, and it had kind of traumatized the poor lads, so Jimbo and I were extra determined to keep our noses clean and be good kids. We were walking back to my house down a street we'd walked down a billion times. Most of the buildings along the street were houses, but a few of them were houses that had been converted into the premises for business. I forget what exactly there was, but one of them was a taxi rank. So they used the living room as a makeshift office, which you could see into through these huge bay windows at the front. There was a 2-car driveway which could house 2 of the taxis, then a couple of other taxis would park on the street. I guess then people would call up and book a taxi and they'd dispatch it to a location, etc. This was years before Uber, back when in the UK anyway, there would just be a designated area in town and whatever for taxis to wait in, or outside the cinema or Hollywood Bowl and all of that. I guess the taxis stayed on this residential street when they weren't in use because the headquarters were there. I could never work out why they needed a whole house as the taxi rank, nor could I imagine what was in the other rooms. I can make a good guess now, but I don't want to spoil anything. Anyway, I'll call these Jabens Munter taxis because it's as good a name as any. So me and Jimbo were making our way home past Munter taxis when I had to stop to do my shoelace up. These were the days before ChatGPT and Skibbity toilets, so you had to tie your own damn shoes back then. So that's what I did. I stopped and crouched down and began to tie my lace. Shock horror. I guess I'd accidentally decided to stop next to one of Munter taxi's cars though, because within seconds of me dropping to my knees, the door to the taxi rank burst open and an angry middle-aged Turkish guy came charging out. He hooted at the top of his voice, screaming at Jimbo and me. What were we doing? Why had we stopped there? What were we trying to do to his effing taxi? He was sick of us damn R-word kids effing up their cars. Were we cops? Were we keying the taxi? Wait, were we cops? Huh? Now I jumped to my feet, gesturing to my half-tied lace, and told him that I had in fact stopped to tie my shoelace. The Turkish man almost exploded in rage at this. I was absolutely baffled. He grabbed me and slammed me against the taxi, which, yeah, nice one, mate. If you're worried about someone vandalizing your stupid arse car, then good idea slamming a body up against it. And Jimbo, of course, decided that now was the perfect time to start taunting this taxi boss, calling him a prick and demanding that he let go of me, that we weren't doing anything wrong. But if he didn't let me go there and then he'd have a lot to reckon with. And I have no idea what Jimbo even had in mind. I don't think he'd ever thrown a punch in his entire life, and still probably hasn't, but he was a mouthy sod at times. Taxi wanker was having none of it and dragged me forward, then slammed me back again. Then he threw me aside and pointed at the car. He screamed that I'd put a dent in it when I'd tied my shoelace, and I helpfully pointed out that it was probably when he slammed me against the taxi just then. And this caused him to grab me and punch me in the stomach. Not very hard, but enough to bring tears to my eyes. Jimbo started yelling at him again, this time taking things a bit more seriously. Meanwhile, two younger guys came out of the taxi rank, a white guy and another Turkish lad. The Turkish lad looked a bit apologetic, but the white guy was someone I'd seen driving the taxis around town before, a bit of a hard nut. He was holding a plank, getting ready to raise it like he was about to brain me with it. This plank guy started yelling at us alongside the taxi driver, and he said that we were the kids who had been repeatedly vandalizing their taxis, and that we were gonna effing pay now that they'd caught us. I had never touched their damn taxis before, apart from actually using their services a few times, and I told them this. I said we lived nearby and were just walking home, and I'd stopped to tie my lace. I again pointed out that my lace was untied, and if they'd just look, they'd see that I hadn't done anything to the freaking taxi. Young Turk leaned in and whispered something to this taxi guy. Plank guy did that thing that the hard kids in schools do, where they lunge at you and then stop, trying to intimidate me. He waved the plank around, and I genuinely thought that he was going to hit me for a second. Jimbo had his phone out, and this was the days of the Nokia 3310s, so we didn't have cameras and stuff like that, but we did have the means to call the law. Jimbo said he was going to dial 999 because we had nothing to hide, and this caused Taxi Wanker to freak out. He started screaming and hollering that if we called the law, we'd be dead men. And Christ on a cracker, buddy, overreacting much? And that's when I twigged that maybe something more serious was going on here than a taxi firm being protective over their vehicles. I figured we probably needed to extricate ourselves from the situation pretty sharply, and I shot Jimbo a look, hoping he'd understand exactly what I was thinking. Instead, he called the men a bunch of tossers. Well, nothing for it. I shoved Taxi Wanker with all my might, knocking him into the plank man, and then Jimbo and I pounded sand and ran down the street, darting across the busy main road and narrowly missing being flattened by the number 8 bus to Staple Grove. Then we were back at my house and home free. My stomach hurt where Taxi Wanker had punched me, but other than that, we were safe, and we vowed that we wouldn't take that shortcut back from the park anymore and thought nothing of it. Now, a few months later, my dad showed me a story in the paper. A local taxi firm had been shut down for their role in distributing heroin and cocaine. And get this, smuggling blood diamonds. And yep, of course, it was Munter Taxis. So I guess that's why they used an entire house as their headquarters, storing and packing drugs, and again, I emphasize this, blood diamonds. Now, Jimbo and I almost came a cropper from honest-to-God blood diamond smugglers. That's kind of badass, if not a bit terrifying, and in retrospect, it's no wonder they got so touchy-feely about me stopping to tie my shoe. This story happened to my mom in the 60s, but she's given me permission to share it with you today. She was about 4 years old and playing with her friends at a local park. It was a whole group of them hanging out in the swings and whatnot. Back then, kids just played without supervision, and we see that as the good old days, but sometimes it's understandable why modern parents are a bit stricter on where their kids can go. Now, this was back in the United Kingdom. Parks used to have a park keeper who would be employed by the council to maintain the grass, keep the play park equipment working, things like that. And now everything is done by outside contractors. But back in the day, it used to be a guy, usually a retiree who wore a park keeper uniform and had a little shack on the corner of the park. Most park keepers would become a popular staple with the kids who played there, and Mr. Claude was no different. Mum says he was a friendly old lad with a twinkle in his eye and a bag of toffees he'd secretly offer to his favorite kids, one of whom was my mum. Mr. Claude was friends with my grandparents too, He'd been a local fixture in the town for as long as they could remember even, and everyone had fond opinions of the old fella. And that's why when Mr. Claude approached Mum in the park that day, she thought nothing of it. He called her over, away from her friends, and patted the bench under the tree for her to sit down. Mum joined him, and he asked if she was having a good day, if she was having fun, if she'd be starting school that autumn, just usual friendly chit-chat from the town's grandpa. Mum was a polite kid who loved to befriend and please adults, so she was only too happy to answer his questions. Mr. Claude reached into his pocket and withdrew his traditional rumpled paper bag of toffees, which he'd buy from the local corner shop. He gave Mum a toffee, and then, after a minute, he asked her if she liked kittens. Of course, what little kid doesn't like kittens? So Mum said yes, and Mr. Claude told her that the park cat, Shelley, had recently had kittens and they were in his park keeper's shack on the other side of the park, if she wanted to see them. Mum did, of course. She hadn't really been briefed that well on stranger danger, but she says that even if she had, it was Mr. Claude, so she would have trusted him enough to go with him. Go with him she did, and he led her by the hand to his hut. Inside, he locked the door, not that Mum realized that at the time, and then had her sit on a stool. She looked around but couldn't see Shelley or the kittens anywhere. Mr. Claude made a point of trying to find the kittens and couldn't, and then pulled a little cat sock puppet out of a drawer. Mum says he made her laugh pretending it was Shelley, the park cat, and everything seemed fine. And then Mr. Claude reached into the drawer again and pulled out a magazine. He showed it to Mum and asked her what she thought of it. It was a nudie magazine. Mum told him she didn't know and got shy and a bit scared. And then Mr. Claude began flicking through the magazine, showing her increasingly explicit images of women. Mum can't remember for sure, as it was nearly 60 years ago now, but she thinks she remembers it being some kind of fetish magazine. Mr. Claude began asking her, a little girl, if she liked what was in the magazine. Again, Mum said that she didn't know, and began to get a bit tearful and scared. Mr. Claude started to get cross with her, and told her that a park keeper was a bit like a policeman, and she had to listen to him and do what he said. I don't want to repeat what he told her to do next, but thank God Mum said no. She jumped off that stool and stomped her foot and told him that grown-ups don't say things like that to little girls. She remembers Mr. Claude laughing at this and telling her that she was a precious little brat. We think that he must have said precocious, but this is how she remembers it. And then he grabbed her by the wrist and began trying to guide her hand somewhere. And to this day, I'm sure someone was looking out for Mum, because before Mr. Claude could do anything, there was a harsh knocking at the door. It was Mum's brothers, Jules and Andrew. They'd come looking for Mum to bring her home for tea, and the other little kids told them that Mr. Claude had taken her to his shed. My Uncle Jules says he always suspected that Mr. Claude was a wrong'un, so he ran straight over. Then when they tried to enter the hut and found it locked, they began to panic. Thankfully, Jules' bashing on the door caused Mr. Claude to panic, and he unlocked the door to let Mum go. When they got home, they told my grandparents how Mr. Claude had tried to behave, but they told Mum that she must have misunderstood him, and that sweet old Mr. Claude wouldn't possibly have wanted to hurt Mum, but she should never go alone with adults like that again, but also definitely shouldn't worry or be traumatized by it. I would be so mad at my grandparents for this, except Uncle Jules concluded the story for us. When the rest of the kids had gone to bed, he stayed up and eavesdropped on Granddad talking to a couple of his work buddies about Mr. Claude. They said it was high time that something was done about that dirty old man. The next week, there was a new park keeper at the local park. Nobody heard from Mr. Claude again. The story went that he'd gone up country to live with his son because he was getting on in years. Maybe that's true. Maybe the local dads chased him off. Or maybe they banded together and delivered another kind of old-fashioned justice. Who can say? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Also, I have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, first rule of Fight Club: twerk.